When I came back from the bathroom that night, at the company party, my world collapsed before an image I could never erase from my memory. Colored lights flashed, the music still vibrated, but everything went silent inside me. She was there, dancing with him, with the boss. The man who always looked at me with a shadow of disdain disguised by a polite smile. They were laughing. His hands were on her waist as if they had been there many other times, and her eyes were not looking for anyone. They were not looking for me. As if I had disappeared from the world. When I approached, with my heart hammering inside my chest and my throat dry, I could not hide the pain. The words came out with difficulty, but they came out. I hope it's just a dance between friends. He laughed, with the kind of laugh that hides nothing, and said, I thought she told you about us. There, in front of everyone, with a glass in his hand and my wedding slipping through his fingers, I died a little. I turned my back and left. I didn't say anything else. I didn't make a scene. I just left, like someone leaving a beautiful dream and being thrown into the reality of a nightmare. I went straight to my lawyer's apartment. I didn't want to think, I didn't want to feel, I just wanted to act. I needed to get out of that marriage before it destroyed what little I had left of me. I prepared the divorce papers that very morning, without anger. The anger came later. At that moment, there was just an enormous silence inside my chest, an absence of everything. As if there was no more sound in the world. In the following days, she tried to talk to me. She tried to justify, cry, say that she was confused. That it was just a moment, that everything had started innocently. But innocent is not the name given to a long, calculated and hidden betrayal. She said that she loved me, that she regretted it, that it had been a mistake, that she had felt alone. But the funny thing is that, until that day, I never knew that love meant hiding messages, lying about meetings, coming back later and acting as if nothing was wrong. I asked myself every night, where did she stop choosing me? I spent weeks sleeping badly, with my memory replaying scenes, laughter, old conversations that suddenly took on new meaning. The trip she cancelled, the weekend with her friends that never happened, the message that arrived in the early hours of the morning and that she swore was from her work group. Everything made sense now. A meaning that hurt. I found myself obsessed with answers that never came. And even if they did, would they make any difference? I didn't want to know why. I wanted to understand how someone who claimed to love me could be so cruel as to sleep with another man, laugh with him, while I made plans, dreamed, believed. The worst thing about betrayal is not the act itself, it's the coldness with which the person who betrays me continues the routine, as if they weren't tearing the other person apart every day in secret. I began to see myself as a stranger. I asked myself 1,000 times if I had failed, if I had been too little, insufficient, too predictable. But time is a silent ally. It doesn't erase pain, but it shows what it means. Little by little, I freed myself from it. Not from the pain, but from her. I realized that I had stopped loving myself in an attempt to keep her close. That I had swallowed silences, postponed desires, repressed wishes, just so she would be happy. And in the end, she chose someone else. When she realized that her boss never intended to stay, that it was all convenience, neediness and vanity, she came after me. But by then, it was too late. I was no longer the same man who was hurt on the dance floor. I was no longer the man who cried alone in the car after leaving the party. And she was still the same woman who lied while looking me in the eyes. Who gave herself to someone else while saying she was just going through a phase. When she knocked on my door, saying that she wanted to come back, that she deeply regretted it, that everything lost its meaning without me, that that man was not who she thought he was. I just looked at her and saw a past that no longer belonged to me. Because love, when it dies, doesn't come back. What comes back is wounded pride, the fear of loneliness, the emptiness of someone who realized the size of their mistake. And she had wronged someone who had always been by her side, even when she didn't deserve it. The curious thing is that, despite everything, I didn't want revenge. I wanted to move on. And I did. At some point, between the mourning and the anger, I found peace. I found a new life, a new companion, a new love that wasn't born out of need, but from a true encounter. Someone who saw me as I was, and not as someone to be molded or compared to. And while I was rebuilding my story, she lived surrounded by regret, mulling over messages I never answered, letters I never read, memories that no longer made sense. And then came the day she showed up at the place where it all began. A simple place, but full of memories. She looked at me with eyes that begged for one more chance, and said, if I could go back. I interrupted her with a slight smile, not of irony, but of relief. You would have done everything the same. Because whoever betrays once is already lost before they even begin. She lowered her eyes. And then, I knew. The cycle was over. I was free. But there's something she never knew. Something no one could have ever imagined. A subtle detail, but one that completely changes what you think about this story. Because her betrayal was the beginning of everything, but it wasn't the real turning point. What happened after was what really sealed our fate. What she did in that last attempt at reconciliation, the words she chose, the secret she kept, and the truth that only came to light when there was no turning back. And maybe, just maybe, if she hadn't said that, everything would have been different. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not support and never romanticize any type of betrayal. All stories presented are fictional, created with the sole purpose of showing, in a dramatic and realistic way, how betrayal can destroy lives, hearts and entire families. Get ready now, because what you're about to hear is strong, emotional and shocking. Fasten your seatbelts, the story is about to begin. Daniel had always been a man of routines. He liked the small certainties in life, coffee with a little sugar, the newspaper on Sunday, the touch of his wife's fingers intertwined with his as he slept. He was a civil engineer, methodical, patient, someone who planned before acting, who measured the land before building. He believed that relationships required the same calculation. Since he was young, he dreamed of forming a solid family, the kind that grows old with photographs scattered around the living room, with children running through the hallways and a love that resists the storms of time. He found a kind of balance in Laura. She was intense, spontaneous, full of ideas and desires that changed with each season. She had a degree in communications, but her true talent was with people. She read looks, understood silences, had that rare kind of empathy that attracted everyone around her. They met during a university event, in a stuffy room with the smell of beer and raised voices. While he watched from afar, uncomfortable with the noise, she danced as if she were alone in the world. That freedom enchanted him, and when he approached her, somewhat awkwardly, he was greeted with a smile that he never forgot. They started dating a few months later, between quick trips, improvised lunches, and late nights sharing dreams in low voices. It was a relationship full of contrasts. Daniel was silence, Laura was noise. He was predictable, she was chaos. But in the midst of it all there was something genuine, a connection that neither of them could explain. After 3 years of dating, they decided to get married. Not because it was the right time, but because they felt they didn't want to live without each other. The ceremony was intimate, with few people, soft music and a starry night that seemed to approve of their union. In their first apartment together, they discovered that love also has its bitter side. The first disagreements came with the bills, with their habits, with their different routines. Laura hated it when he left the towel on the bed, and Daniel was irritated by the mess she made in the kitchen. But they learned. With each other, with each other. They adapted like someone building a shelter in the middle of the unknown. Little by little, they created their own rituals. Sunday was the day for a marathon of old movies, Fridays were sacred for going out as a couple, and every wedding anniversary was celebrated in the same Italian restaurant as the first night as husband and wife. Stability came over the years. Daniel was promoted at work, taking on bigger projects with more responsibility. Laura, in turn, founded a small events agency, something she had always wanted, and began to gain visibility in the social circle. The house where they lived was spacious, with light walls, well-chosen furniture, and paintings that she herself selected with a careful eye. They both knew that life was not a fairy tale, but they were proud of what they had built. They had mutual respect, frequent conversations, and evident affection. Friends used to say that they were the most in tune couple in the group, and both smiled many times when they heard this, believing that it was, in fact, true. They had no children, not yet, but the subject came up frequently. Laura hesitated, saying that she wanted to wait for the right moment, but Daniel already saw himself as a father, already imagining a girl's face with his wife's eyes and her sense of calm. He never pressured her. He had learned, over time, that some desires need space to mature. There was an almost choreographed dynamic between them. Daniel would leave early, come back before sunset, they would have dinner together, talk about the day, watch an episode or two of a series, and then go to sleep. On Saturdays, he would make pancakes and Laura would always complain that they were burnt, even though she ate them all. She spent more time away, events took up her nights, her weekends, her unpredictable schedules. But he trusted her. Not just because he wanted to, but because he believed that the basis of everything was respect. And Laura, despite her absences, was always affectionate and attentive. She would fill the fridge with things he liked, send him messages during the day, record funny videos to make him smile in tense moments. She seemed happy. And he definitely was. Deep down, he felt that he had arrived where he always wanted, a home, a partner, emotional and professional stability. One night, when they returned from a trip to celebrate their wedding anniversary, Daniel commented on how he felt that this year would be even better. He had plans to expand a project, he wanted to travel more with her, maybe even surprise her and propose a bigger house, with a room reserved for a future child. Laura smiled, rested her head on his shoulder and told him she loved him. At that moment, he believed that love was invincible. But there were subtleties. Small gestures that changed over time. The messages became less frequent, the hugs shorter, the glances more distant. She started taking longer in the shower, she locked her cell phone with a password, she avoided contact when they were with friends. Daniel noticed, but never suspected. He attributed it to routine, to the stress of work, to the natural changes of a years-long relationship. When he tried to talk to her, she said she was tired, that she needed space, that everything was fine. He believed her. Not out of naivety, but out of love. Sundays started to get quiet. Laura said she needed to rest, that she wanted to watch her series alone, that she didn't want to go out. So Daniel would go to the market alone, make lunch, set the table and wait for her. Sometimes I ate alone, sometimes with her, but I felt that something invisible was growing between the two of us. I couldn't name it, I didn't want to name it. Still, I kept trying. She brought flowers, planned dinners, wrote notes. She thanked us, smiled, but the glow wasn't the same. It turns out that, often, those who truly love are the last to realize that they're losing. Because love blinds, intoxicates, makes you believe that everything can be solved with patience and affection. And Daniel was patient. He was affectionate. But he felt an emptiness that grew without explanation. When they were invited to Laura's company party, he was excited. He thought it would be an opportunity to relive the couple they once were. He bought a new shirt, chose a special wine to give to the host, and rehearsed compliments to give her that night. Laura seemed excited too, she was beautiful, wearing a dress he had never seen before. In the car, they laughed and sang the song that marked their honeymoon. When they got there, Daniel held her hand tightly, proudly. And for a few minutes, everything seemed right again. She was smiling, talking to everyone, dancing lightly like she used to in the old days. But something in him still hesitated. It was as if, deep down, he knew that there was a crack through which everything that once brought them together was slipping away. Daniel believed that that night would be the beginning of a new phase. That everything would be resolved with a longer hug, an honest conversation and a little time. But time is sometimes cruel. And not all stories have the kind of ending that love deserves. What he didn't know, standing there next to the drinks table, is that the world he had built with so much dedication was about to silently crumble before his eyes. And it would all start with a dance. That night, when they arrived at the party, Laura seemed different. Lighter, more smiling, her eyes shining in a way Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. The room was elegantly decorated, an environment of polite smiles, background music and glasses of sparkling wine clinking everywhere. He held her hand tightly, feeling like someone who was about to win back what had once been his in its entirety. They talked to some of her colleagues, toasted the success of the agency, took pictures together. For a brief moment, Daniel believed that everything he had felt wrong in the last few months might have just been tiredness or his mind overreacting. But as the night went on, small details began to catch his attention. Laura would often walk away, saying she had to say hello to someone, and she would take too long to come back. When she did return, she would bring a new glass of wine, a wider smile, and a subtle scent of perfume that wasn't hers. Daniel tried not to harbor suspicions. He kept telling himself that there was no real reason to worry, that it was just a party, that she was sociable by nature. But the discomfort grew slowly, like a hidden ember under the wood, ready to set everything on fire. At one point, Laura disappeared for more than 20 minutes. He looked for her among the guests, at the tables, even in the outside garden. Nothing. When he returned to the main hall, she was back there, laughing next to a tall man in a dark suit, with an overly confident expression. Laura introduced him with a polite smile, saying that he was the director of the agency's expansion area, someone important to the business, a contact who could boost the next projects. Daniel shook her hand, still trying to remain calm, but something in that exchange of glances made him shiver inside. For the rest of the evening, the director never left his side. In every conversation, in every movement, he seemed to insinuate himself discreetly but deliberately. Laura, on the other hand, acted with an uncomfortable naturalness. She touched the man's arm when she laughed, leaned her body towards him, and when Daniel said something, she took a while to respond, as if she were on another frequency. He tried to talk, tried to bring her closer with a gesture, a comment, a dance. But she refused. She said she needed to move around, that she wanted to make the most of the night to strengthen contacts. Daniel walked away, went to the bar, ordered a shot of whiskey and watched. He didn't want to confront her. Not here. But something had changed, and he could feel it, even without understanding exactly what. Time passed, and he decided to go to the bathroom. He washed his face, took a deep breath, looked at himself in the mirror, trying to find some answer in his own eyes. When he came back, the room was emptier, the music louder, the bodies looser on the dance floor. And that's when he saw it. In the middle of the lights, between laughter and slow turns, she was in the director's arms. They danced as if they were intimate, as if that were the only place in the world. She smiled, with her eyes closed, while he held her by the waist, their faces dangerously close. Daniel stood still, with the glass still in his hand. His heart raced uncomfortably, the air seemed thin. He walked towards them with firm but not fast steps. He stopped in front of the couple. Laura turned slowly, and her eyes met his with contained fright. Then he said, in a low, firm voice, "I hope it's just a dance between friends." The silence didn't last long. The man looked at Daniel, raised an eyebrow and said, almost disdainfully, "I thought she told you about us." Those words fell like a sharp blade on his skin. Daniel didn't answer. He didn't look at Laura, he didn't look at anyone. He just turned and left. The night was cold, the wind biting his face as if the whole world were mocking him. He got in his car and drove aimlessly for a few minutes, until he stopped in front of his lawyer's building. There was no anger at that moment, there was only an urgency to close what was already dead. He asked for the divorce papers to be prepared, signed where needed, and left the rest to be sorted out in the following days. He didn't want to sleep at home. The idea of going back and seeing her, hearing empty explanations, was unbearable. He spent the night in a nearby hotel, where solitude seemed more honest than any words of comfort. The next day, Laura called. Several times. She sent messages, long, short, desperate. He didn't answer. Silence was the only way to keep from getting even more lost. In the days that followed, she came to his house a few times. She tried to talk, she cried, she begged. She said it was a mistake, that she didn't know what she was doing, that she felt alone, forgotten, empty. Daniel listened to her, but he didn't answer. He was so tired of trying to understand what had happened that he just wanted to get out of there. She said she still loved him, that everything had happened so quickly, so confusingly, that the other man meant nothing. He didn't believe her. And maybe, more than that, he didn't care anymore. Friends began to find out, one by one. The connections came full of questions, solidarity, and attempts at consolation. But Daniel didn't want consolation. He wanted peace. He wanted to rediscover the silence he had lost. He threw himself into work, started going to new places, and started running every day as a way of emptying himself. At night, he would look at the ceiling of the room where he had once slept with Laura and wonder when she had stopped loving him. He couldn't find an answer. He began to get rid of objects, clothes, and photos. Not out of hatred, but with the intention of starting over. A real, clean, and free from poisoned memories. One day, when he left the house, he found an envelope on the doorstep. It was a letter from Laura. Long, handwritten, in a handwriting he knew so well. She said she still loved him, that she had made the worst mistake of her life, that the other man was just a momentary distraction, a reflection of her insecurities. She said she was lost, but that now she could see everything clearly. She asked for a second chance, begged for a reunion, promised change. Daniel read it all carefully. There was no anger in his hands, just a strange feeling of pity. He put the letter in a drawer, along with other things he still couldn't bring himself to throw away, and left. The pain was no longer the same. It had transformed into something else. Into strength, perhaps. Into a kind of lucidity that can only be achieved after having your heart broken. He began to look at people differently, more carefully, less hastily. He met a woman in a coffee shop, weeks later. They talked about music, old movies, the city. They didn't exchange phone numbers, didn't make plans. But for the first time, he felt something like peace. Life was starting to turn around again, albeit slowly. And Laura. Laura kept trying, showing up unexpectedly, sending messages. Sometimes she cried at his door, other times she declared herself as if nothing had happened. But he was no longer the man who once believed that love was enough. Love, he now knew, required loyalty, respect, truth. Time passed, the divorce papers were filed. The house was divided, the furniture was rearranged. And Laura disappeared for a while. Until, a month later, she came back. She showed up at his door with a different look in her eyes, a calmer tone of voice, almost resigned. She said she needed to tell him something. Something that could change everything. Something that might explain what she did. Daniel watched her in silence. There was something in her eyes that wasn't pretend. A real weight, an uncontainable guilt. She took a deep breath, hesitated, and then said. "There's something you need to know. I should have told you sooner. But I was scared. Scared of what it might cause." And in that moment, Daniel knew that he hadn't heard everything yet. That as much as the pain of betrayal was immense, what was to come now could be even more devastating. Laura entered with hesitant steps, her eyes restless and her shoulders tense as if they were carrying the weight of years. Daniel didn't move. He observed every detail of her expression, as if trying to predict what was coming. She stopped in the middle of the room, took a deep breath and held her hands together as if trying to stop her own body from shaking. The silence between them was thick, almost solid. Laura said she needed to talk, that there was something he didn't know, something she had kept inside for too long and that consumed her day after day. He kept his gaze fixed, unhurried, but not welcoming. There was no more tenderness in his eyes, just a kind of attentive weariness. Then she sat down in the armchair next to him and began, as if she were walking into a minefield without knowing where she was stepping. She said she didn't want to justify anything, that what she had done that night, and in the months leading up to it, was unforgivable, that she knew that. But that, even so, she needed to tell the truth before it was too late. Daniel simply replied that she had 3 minutes before he got up and left, and that whatever it was, there was no more room for excuses, only for truths. Laura lowered her head and, in a whisper, began to tell how it had all really started. Not at that party. Nor the month before. It wasn't something impulsive or casual. She said that she had been approached by the company's director at a moment of weakness, but it wasn't just seduction or need. There was something darker. An agreement. Daniel frowned and sat up straighter in his chair. Laura revealed that, months before that night, the man, her boss, had discovered that she had committed a serious ethical violation in one of the agency's contracts. A mistake that could have bankrupted an important account. He used it against her. He said that if she wanted to keep her name clean, her job, and the reputation she had earned with so much effort, she should, in her words, be useful in another way. Laura cried as she spoke. She said that at first she resisted, but that her fear of ruin was greater. That she felt cornered, dirty, used. And that, even so, she accepted. Daniel stared at her with his jaw clenched, his fists clenched. She continued. She said that, over time, the tables had turned. That her boss had started treating her with a seductive closeness, getting her emotionally involved, promising support, protection, a partnership that went beyond the professional. And she, already wrapped up in guilt and fragility, ended up confusing manipulation with affection. She said that, yes, she had had an affair with him. But that what he wanted was something else. He wanted to hurt Daniel. The director knew who he was, knew about an old unresolved rivalry in the construction industry, a professional disagreement that had generated deep resentment in the past. Daniel, confused, stood up. Laura asked him to wait. She said that the man had approached her intentionally, knowing who her husband was, and that everything, absolutely everything, had been calculated as a form of personal humiliation. A plan for revenge. And she allowed it. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. His blood was rising in waves, and his chest hurt with intense pressure, as if he were being crushed from the inside. The anger was almost physical, palpable, but there was also a deeper kind of pain, the pain of having been betrayed not only in love, but in the most basic respect as a human being. Daniel paced the room, breathing heavily. Laura kept talking, between tears and suffocated pauses. She said that when the director introduced her at the party as Daniel's wife, it was as if she were stamping victory in her personal war. He made a point of provoking him, of saying out loud what Laura had never had the courage to say in private. And that was the last straw. Laura said that the day after the party, everything fell apart. The director dismissed her coldly. He said he had already gotten what he wanted. That now she was no longer of any use. She tried to backtrack, tried to talk, but was ignored. And in that moment, she realized that she had been just a pawn in a game that she had never fully understood. Daniel interrupted her. He wanted to know why she hadn't told him everything before. Why she had hidden it for so long, even when he had asked for the truth, even when she said she was sorry. Laura said she couldn't. That she felt ashamed, humiliated. That she still believed that if he knew everything, he would never look at her again. And that, even though he had destroyed their marriage, there was still a part of her that loved him so much that she couldn't bear to lose him forever. Daniel, with red eyes, asked if, at any point, she had thought about him during all of that. If, at any point, she had imagined the impact of being used, betrayed, diminished like that. She answered that she thought about it all the time. That every time she saw him sleeping next to her, she felt the guilt grow like a tumor inside her chest. And that this had led her to almost confess several times. But she always backed down. Because she knew that the truth was the end. He sat down again, leaned his elbows on his knees and covered his face with his hands. The silence between them seemed eternal. Laura tried to get closer, but he pushed her body away. He said that hearing that was like dying while alive. That he didn't know what hurt more, the physical betrayal, the emotional betrayal, or the fact that he had been the target of a revenge that wasn't even his. He said he felt ashamed, not of her, but of himself, for having been deceived for so long, for having believed in empty smiles, for having loved someone who was capable of exchanging him for protection and convenience. Laura fell to her knees on the floor. She was crying with her whole body, saying that she would do anything to undo what she had done. That she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she needed him to know the truth. That she didn't want to carry this secret another day. Daniel got up and went to the window. He stood there for a few minutes, with his back to her. Then he turned to her and said that, at that moment, he no longer felt anything. Neither anger nor sadness. Just an immense emptiness. A hole where there used to be a home. He said that the only thing left was time. That maybe he would heal, or maybe not. But that she would no longer be part of his story. And then he asked her to leave. He said it calmly, without shouting, without resentment. Just with the certainty that that cycle was over. Laura got up slowly. She picked up her bag, walked to the door and, before leaving, looked at him one last time. She told him that she loved him. He didn't answer. The door closed behind her, and silence once again dominated the room. But now, it was no longer the same silence as before. It was different. It was a silence of beginning again. Of something that was just beginning. Laura didn't look for him again in the following days. The silence that fell after the revelation was complete, absolute. It was as if they both knew that any new attempt would be an unnecessary extension of something that had already died. Daniel began to avoid everything that could remind him of her, the streets they walked, the restaurant where they celebrated their last wedding anniversary, even the coffee shop where she liked to order that overly sweet latte. The house now seemed like a neutral space, where time had stopped, but he needed it temporarily, like a ruined port where he could still breathe before moving on. It was at that moment that he decided to do what he had been putting off for weeks: he sold the house. He hired a company to pack his belongings, separating only a few clothes, documents, books and photographs that still connected him to his essence. He left the rest behind. He signed the papers with the coldness of someone who no longer feels like he belongs. He moved to a smaller, higher apartment, with large windows and no memories. He chose a different, less familiar neighborhood, where he could walk without fear of bumping into faces from the past. He started running at dawn. He ran for time, not distance. Sometimes, he would stop, sweaty and out of breath, on a random street, without knowing exactly why that point in the route had made him stop. It wasn't sadness that he felt, it was something between exhaustion and freedom. Freedom, however, still came with a pain embedded in it, the pain of realizing that now everything he did was for himself. At work, he avoided long conversations. He met deadlines with surgical precision, immersed in spreadsheets and reports. When people asked him how he was, he would just say, getting on with life. He didn't talk about Laura, and no one dared mention it. Little by little, his colleagues began to understand that his silence was more eloquent than any outburst. A few months later, he was invited by a close friend to a small charity event at a sustainable architecture institute. It wasn't the kind of place he usually went to, but he accepted it as if he were taking a break. The place was airy, modern, full of students, enthusiastic professionals, and presentations that combined technology and social purpose. While he was listening to a lecture on ecological materials, a woman sat down next to him. She had wavy hair, curious brown eyes, and a serene presence. She smiled, and he returned it with a brief nod. At the end of the lecture, she struck up a conversation. She said she already knew him by name, that she had read a technical article he had written in a specialized magazine. They exchanged a few words, a bit of shy humor, and then went together to the cocktail party served in the garden. They talked for over an hour. Nothing special, nothing deep, but there was a lightness there that he hadn't felt in a long time. Her name was Clara. Clara was different from Laura in almost every way. More introspective, more observant, less volatile. She had a way of speaking that seemed to ponder each word before saying it. She showed no urgency to show herself, nor anxiety to conquer. She was simply present, with authenticity and kindness. In the following days, they exchanged messages. They talked about projects, trips, books. Daniel, cautious, avoided any immediate emotional involvement, but he could not help but feel a growing curiosity. He felt like someone relearning how to walk. Their meetings became frequent, but without expectations. A coffee here, a walk there. And it was on one of those afternoons that Clara told him something he had not expected to hear. She said she admired the way he looked at things. That she saw in him a rare maturity, a silence that said a lot. Daniel did not respond immediately. He smiled, but something inside him trembled. Meanwhile, Laura reappeared. Not at his door, but in his life. Through a call from the lawyer who was handling the final stages of the divorce. She had requested a change in the property agreement, asking to give up part of her assets. She said she wanted everything to go to him. It was her way of closing the story in peace. Daniel found it strange. That didn't seem like a normal gesture. He asked if she was okay, and the lawyer replied that she seemed different. A few weeks later, he received a letter. There were no apologies or pleas. It was a blunt request for forgiveness. Laura said she had lost everything, and she wasn't referring to her assets. She said she was going through a difficult internal process, that she was seeking therapeutic help, that she had moved away from the city and cut off contact with her former boss, that she was now facing serious allegations of harassment by other women at the agency. She confessed that she had been an accomplice to something rotten, and that now she needed to rebuild her identity from scratch. She said that if she had loved herself with half the love he gave her, she might never have done what she did. Daniel read the letter without feeling emotional. But there was something to think about. For the first time, Laura seemed to speak like someone who didn't expect anything in return. She just wanted to be heard. She put the letter in a box and didn't respond. Not out of pride, but because she had already accepted that their cycle was over, and that answers didn't always need to be said. The following week, Clara invited him for a walk outside the city. To a simple place, with trails and lakes. They went together, by car, listening to music, talking. During the walk, she stopped in front of a tall tree and said that she usually came there when she wanted to make important decisions. Daniel asked if she was making any decisions now. She smiled and said no, that she just wanted to share that place with someone who respected silence. They sat under the shade of the tree, in silence, for minutes that seemed like hours. And in that moment, without it being said out loud, Daniel knew that peace was not a distant promise. It was possible, it was real, and it was within reach. A few days later, while sorting through some old papers, he found a photo of him and Laura on an old trip. He thought about throwing it away, but hesitated. He put it in a folder, along with her letter. Not because it still hurt, but because that pain had shaped the man he was now. And there was something valuable in remembering his own journey. He went to the porch, where Clara was waiting for him with 2 cups of tea. They sat down, and she asked him what he thought about planting some flowers there. He said it was a good idea. And in that moment, between the end of one story and the beginning of another, he knew he had survived. And more than that, he had started over. The weeks following that trip with Clara marked a silent and definitive transition in Daniel's life. There was no exact milestone, no grand event that symbolized the new beginning, but the days began to take on a different tone, less harsh, more fulfilling. The pain that had previously been a constant shadow now seemed to dissolve little by little, like fog dissipating with the morning sun. Clara's presence did not cure him, and he knew it, but it allowed him to inhabit his own pain without being swallowed by it. She was a woman who did not demand forced smiles from him, who did not ask more than he could answer, and who respected the presence of absence in his gaze. And perhaps for this reason, without any pressure, Daniel allowed himself to open up. He began to talk, slowly, about what he had experienced, about the scars that still burned, although invisible. He did not count on dramatizations or anger. He simply recounted honestly what he had been through, and with each confession, he felt a weight lifted from his shoulders, as if by sharing, he reorganized his feelings. While Clara was gaining space in his life, Laura was disappearing from his orbit. No new letters, no new contact. But her absence was now a constant reminder, because there was something still to be resolved within him, something that not even time could easily organize, the memory of good times. Love, when true at some point in time, does not disappear without leaving a sound. He still found himself, from time to time, being invaded by scenes from the past that no longer caused him pain, but a kind of soft melancholy, difficult to explain. There was no desire to go back, nor to relive, but there was the persistent question, what if everything had been different? What if she had chosen another path? What if he had realized it sooner? This kind of dilemma, even if silent, gnawed at him on longer nights. Clara noticed these silences, respected them, and over time, she began to share hers too. She had lost someone in the past. A sudden loss, not by betrayal, but by fate. And although the reason was different, there was an inexplicable connection there. They both knew what it was like to rebuild from pieces that no one else saw. The relationship between the two evolved naturally. Quiet dinners at home, improvised weekends, small routines that fit together like pieces of a calmly assembled puzzle. Clara was careful with what she said, but genuine in her gestures. Daniel, on the other hand, was still afraid to give himself completely. It wasn't insecurity in the love that was emerging, it was the caution of someone who had already bet everything and watched the house fall apart. But even with the fear, there was surrender. A more mature, more conscious, less idealized surrender. And it was in this new space that he began to understand, in a deeper way, what it really means to move on. It's not forgetting or erasing. It's looking back with respect, but not with attachment. It's accepting that certain pains shape, but don't define. It was on a gray afternoon, one of those when the rain doesn't actually fall but covers the sky with a strange tension, that Daniel received an unexpected call. It was Laura's sister. Her voice was nervous, hesitant, as if she didn't know if she should have made that call. She said that Laura was admitted to a psychiatric clinic outside the city. That she had had an emotional breakdown, followed by a desperate attempt to disappear from the map. That she wasn't well, and that she was going through a deep process of reconstruction. Daniel fell silent. His heart beat in a strange rhythm, not of love, but of a feeling that was hard to name. Her sister said that Laura talked about him a lot. Not in a possessive or obsessive way, but like someone who carried too much guilt and needed to ask for forgiveness in a real way, not with words, but with actions. She said that Laura wasn't asking to see him. That she wasn't interested in getting back together. That she just wanted him to know what was happening, to know that she was facing it with the dignity she hadn't had in the past. Daniel spent the rest of the day in silence, without sharing the news with anyone. Not even Clara. He didn't know what to do with that information. Why did it still affect him? It wasn't love. He knew that. It was something else. A mixture of compassion, astonishment, and an inevitable connection with someone who had been such a profound part of his story. That night was long. He thought about everything, what Laura had done, what he had suffered, what he had silently forgiven, and what still hurt even when he said it didn't hurt anymore. And as the hours passed, something inside him changed. It wasn't pity. It was a sense of humanity that he no longer wanted to deny. The next morning, he wrote a letter. Simple. Short. He simply said that he knew what she was going through, that he hoped she would rebuild herself with the strength he knew she had. And that, despite everything, he had found peace. He asked her to find it too. There was no address, no full signature. Just a final, honest gesture from someone who chose to end the story without hurt. In the following days, he returned to his routine. But my perception of the world was different. Something inside him had settled down, as if the last piece of a large puzzle had been put in place. The pain stopped casting a shadow. The memory became just that, a memory. He started planning a short trip with Clara. Something unhurried, with no fixed destination. They wanted to visit a new place, see different landscapes, allow themselves the luxury of starting something light, after everything they had carried. And one of those nights, while they were organizing their plans, Clara looked at him and said that she had never met anyone with such a capacity for reconstruction. Daniel smiled. Not like someone receiving a compliment, but like someone who knows that the pain was not in vain. There was, however, a point inside him that still needed to be resolved. Something that had no direct relation to Laura or the past. It was something more internal, a voice that kept asking if he had done everything he could. Not for her, but for himself. And it was in this impulse that he made one last decision. He spent an entire weekend writing a text. Not a letter, not a book, but a kind of personal manifesto. In it, he recounted everything he had experienced, without dramatization, without victimization. He told how betrayal broke him, but also how it freed him. How hatred almost consumed him, but how the choice not to retaliate was what saved him. He spoke about love as a conscious choice, about the value of loyalty, about the weight of silence, about how reconstruction does not come with ready-made answers, but with small, constant decisions. He printed the text, folded it, and put it in a drawer of his desk, along with other memories. He didn't know if anyone would ever read it. But I knew that there was everything that needed to be said. No shouting. No accusing. No hiding. Clara hugged him that night without asking questions. She didn't need to. You knew that sometimes the quietest gestures are the most healing. And so, between plans and silences, Daniel prepared himself for a new chapter. A chapter that was no longer defined by wounds, but by conscious choices. Life, finally, was his again. And now, he knew exactly what to do with it. Autumn arrived without warning, and with it came the winds that brought that smell of dry leaves and memories of what had been. The mornings grew colder, the sky dawned with shades of gray and amber, and Daniel found himself contemplating life through a different lens, more serene, cleaner. The apartment, which once seemed like a temporary shelter, now took on the shape of a home. Clara brought small changes over time, a new painting, plants on the balcony, books scattered on the shelves, nothing imposed, everything constructed. But even with this new stability emerging, there was something in Daniel that made him gaze at the horizon for a long time. It wasn't sadness, nor regret. It was a complex feeling of completion, like someone who finishes a very important book and needs time before starting another. At that moment in his life, he was between the absolute end of one love and the real possibility of another. It wasn't about choosing between two women, because what he felt for Laura no longer existed. It was, rather, an internal choice, to remain with open scars or to accept them as part of one's own skin. Clara, with her silent sensitivity, noticed these transitions. She never pressured him, but she never left him either. When she saw Daniel quiet for longer than usual, she would just come over and offer him coffee, or play some soft music in the background. One of these afternoons, the two of them were sitting by the lake in a nearby town, where they had decided to spend the weekend. Clara watched the ducks swimming while Daniel, lost in thought, told her something he had never said out loud before. He said he didn't know if he believed in love as destiny anymore, but that now he understood that love can be a decision that is renewed every day, even when the memory insists on pulling us back to what hurt. Clara looked at him tenderly and simply replied that she was there not to be his new destiny, but to walk with him, wherever he was willing to go. That answer needed no additions. That was all he needed to hear at that moment. A few days later, Daniel received an unexpected invitation. An old coworker, with whom he had lost contact after the divorce, approached him to speak at a conference on emotional architecture, a meeting that combined art, engineering, and the reconstruction of emotional environments through architecture. Initially, he was hesitant. He didn't see himself as someone willing to go up on stage and share his story. But something about that invitation moved him. It was as if life was silently asking him to transform his pain into something greater. Clara encouraged him. She said that perhaps it was time to let other people see how it was possible to rebuild oneself, without having to erase what one had experienced. And so he accepted. He prepared his presentation carefully, mixing technical elements with discrete accounts of his own life, not as a rant, but as a message: what we break, we can also rebuild. On the day of the presentation, the auditorium was packed. Daniel began with a brief silence, then said that we often build houses with such care that we forget that the people who live in them are people, and that the hardest walls to build are the ones inside. He spoke about fragility, about the power of invisible structures, about the impact of details. And then, in an unexpected moment, he shared the most profound metaphor of the night, that love is like a home. It can have cracks, leaks, windows that don't close properly. But if the foundations are intact, there is always a way to restore it. And when the foundations give way, the best we can do is let them crumble and start over, with more wisdom. At the end of the talk, he received a standing ovation. He felt a lump in his throat, but he didn't cry. For the first time, he didn't feel pain when he remembered. He felt pride. After the event, while walking with Clara down a tree-lined street, she held his hand tighter and said that she felt he was ready now. Daniel, not understanding right away, asked, "Ready for what?" and she replied with a smile, "To love again without fear." That night, they made love with a different surrender, as if each touch was a letter of commitment between two mature souls who knew what it was like to lose everything and still carry on. The next morning, she made a simple coffee and sat facing him on the porch. There was a peace there that did not depend on words. Only the sound of the wind in her eyes said more than any statement could. However, as life rarely allows everything to settle down without testing, Daniel was surprised by an email, days later, coming directly from the clinic where Laura was hospitalized. It was short. It said only that she had requested a visit, not to get back together, but to close a cycle. The decision was his. He stood paralyzed in front of the screen. He didn't want to open wounds. But also, out of pride, he didn't want to let the story end with any pending issues. He spent 3 days reflecting. He talked to Clara about it. He expected jealousy, perhaps insecurity. But what he received was understanding. Clara said that he didn't need to ask for permission. That he was free to do whatever his heart asked. And that, if after that, he still wanted to stay, she would be there. With that gesture, Daniel understood that true love is freedom, not demands. At the end of the week, he got in his car and drove to the place he had been told. It was a discreet clinic, surrounded by trees, where the architecture was more reminiscent of a retreat than a hospital. When he arrived, he was greeted by a therapist who showed him to a large room with light walls and comfortable chairs. Laura came in a few minutes later. She was visibly thinner, her eyes sunken, her hair tied in a makeshift bun. But there was something new about her, a calmer weariness, a more complete presence. They sat across from each other. For a few minutes, they said nothing. Then she began. He said he didn't expect forgiveness or reconciliation. That he just wanted to see him one last time to thank him. To thank him for being the only one who had truly loved her, even when she couldn't love herself. He said he now understood the damage he had caused. Not just to him, but to herself. That the betrayal didn't start with the act, but with the choices she made before she even knew they were wrong. She said she had allowed herself to be manipulated by someone thirsting for revenge and that, in the process, she had lost everything that was essential. Daniel listened attentively, without interrupting. When she finished, he took a deep breath and responded. He said he no longer hated her. That he had understood that everyone has weaknesses, and that her mistake did not erase the good times, but it did not justify the bad ones either. He said he had moved on, and that what they had experienced now was part of another place inside him. He said he hoped she would heal, and that she would find a path that would allow her to live truthfully. Laura smiled with tears in her eyes. He said that it was enough to have been loved by him once. And that, even if she had destroyed him, had changed his life forever. They stood up, exchanged a long hug, without rushing, without tension, without desire. A hug between two who had once been home to each other, but who now knew that their paths were heading in different directions. On the way back, Daniel turned on the radio, but then turned it off. He preferred to listen to the sound of the wind. I knew that this trip was symbolic, the last step in a long and painful process. When he got home, he found Clara sitting on the balcony, reading. She looked up, smiled and asked if he was okay. Daniel said yes, but not with a word. He just came closer, held her hand and kissed her. And there, with the complicit silence between them, he understood that true love does not arrive like a hurricane, but like a wind that slowly comes in and clears away the dust of everything that was once ruin. And that sometimes, the greatest proof of love one can give is simply to stay. The months that followed were like a new breath blowing through a field after a fire, with the soil still hot but finally fertile. Daniel and Clara, now more in tune than ever, began to cultivate not only their relationship, but also a new way of seeing life. Neither of them was naive. Neither believed in empty promises. They knew that real love was not based on idealizations, but on conscious, daily choices, on accepting the other's pain and on respecting what came before. And it was with this maturity that, one day, while they were walking through a craft fair, Clara told him naturally that she wanted to build a home with him, but that this would only make sense if it started from a common desire, not from a need. Daniel stopped, looked at her with the depth of someone who has had the world collapse on top of him, and said that, for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The answer came with a long, silent kiss, which sealed a commitment that needed no words. While Daniel's life was taking on new colors, Laura continued her process of rebuilding, but on a completely different path. Her hospitalization had ended, and she now lived alone in a small house in the mountains, far from the noise, far from everything that had once made her feel great. He worked as a gardener, a simple craft he had learned at the clinic, and which now gave him meaning and a kind of peace he had never experienced before. He planted, watered, pruned, and watched the flowers bloom with the same delicacy that he tried to cultivate in himself. His routine was solitary, but not bitter. He no longer sought applause or validation, just coherence. He did not seek new loves. He did not want to. He knew that there was still much inside him that needed to be understood before offering anything to anyone. And little by little, he learned to live with the ghosts he had created, to look at his ruins with honesty, without victimizing himself, without defending himself. She wrote letters she never sent, letters to herself, letters to a Daniel from the past, letters to a future that might never come. But that was how she dealt with her story, writing, acknowledging, accepting. The man with whom she destroyed her marriage, the man who had promised power, protection and attention, had a different end. After a series of internal and external complaints, he lost his position at the company he had valued so much. The investigations revealed a web of manipulation, coercion and abuse of authority that had been going on for a long time. He tried to stay in the market, but his name became synonymous with scandal and opportunism. His wife, upon discovering his systematic betrayals and dirty games, filed for divorce and left him with almost nothing. His children moved away, his reputation fell apart like wet paper and he found himself alone, living on charity in a tiny apartment, trying to reinvent himself as a freelance consultant, but with no one willing to trust him. Those who saw him said he was just an empty man, living on distorted memories of the prestige he had and that now he only served as a warning to those who think they can walk all over others with impunity. The revenge he planned against Daniel ended up being his own sentence, and the trophy he thought he carried, Laura, had been just another broken piece on his vanity board. Years later, now in a new home, Clara and Daniel celebrated a special date. Not a wedding date, because they never formalized that union on paper, but a symbolic date, the day she appeared in his life. They decided to celebrate with a simple, candlelit dinner, listening to a playlist that they had put together over the years. It was a calm evening, without pomp, but full of meaning. After dinner, Clara held his hand and asked, in that calm tone that defined her, if he still thought about the past. Daniel answered yes, that sometimes the memory came back, but without pain. It came like an important chapter in a bigger book. Without that chapter, he would not have learned to love more honestly, would not have understood his own value, would not have found peace. Clara smiled, rested her head on his shoulder, and together they remained in silence, listening to the music playing in the background, as if each note said what no longer needed to be said. That same night, before going to sleep, Daniel looked at the box where he kept a few memories of what he had experienced with Laura. The photo, the letter, the manifesto he had written to himself. He took a deep breath, took everything out, read it one last time, and then, without hesitation, put everything in a bag and took it to the fireplace. Clara watched him from afar, without intervening. He lit the fire, waited for the flames to grow, and one by one, he threw the pages inside. He saw the paper turn to ashes, the words turn to smoke, and with that, he felt something dissolve inside him. When he returned to the room, Clara hugged him and said, "Now, everything is where it should be." And he agreed. The past had finally been left in its rightful place, in the past. If you've made it this far, you've certainly felt every emotion in this story. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think of this plot? Which part touched your feelings the most? Leave your comment below, because your opinion is very important. And of course, if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to the channel now. Here, every week, you'll find strong, engaging stories with endings that won't leave your mind. And let this story serve as a reflection. Betrayal does not only destroy relationships, it erodes values, families, friendships, and even the very identity of the person who betrays. The damage goes beyond what can be seen, it leaves a lasting mark. Remember, this channel does not support, encourage or normalize any type of cheating. Here, we tell fictional stories that show, in depth, the real consequences of this type of choice. See you in the next story. And until then, choose to love with truth.